And so in our last sermon together last week, we were talking about repeating themes or repeating events in the Gospel of Mark. And we highlighted a few. For example, the Sabbath. You'll find the Sabbath is mentioned a few times in the Gospel of Mark, mainly in chapter 1, then in chapter 2, and then again in chapter 3. The Sabbath keeps coming up, right? We saw another repeating theme in the Gospel of Mark, and that was individuals reaching out to touch Jesus. It wasn't just the woman who had the hemorrhage that reached out and touched Jesus, but we read in Mark chapter 3 that the crowds were trying to reach out and touch Jesus. The woman with the hemorrhage reached out and touched Jesus. And then again, I think in chapter 6, it says that again, the crowds were reaching out to touch Jesus. So these are just some of the repeating themes and the repeating events in the Gospel of Mark. And then we have another set of repeating stories in the Gospel of Mark, which is what we're going to talk about today. And I gave you the homework. I don't know how many of you did this or not, but I gave you the homework. I asked you to look at these four repeating stories: the calming of the storm, the feeding of the multitudes, and then the healing spit, and then again the healing spit with the walking trees. And I asked you to read these stories this week and see if you can figure out why these stories repeat themselves in the Gospel of Mark. And so that's what we want to look at today, is explore these repeating stories of the storm, feeding the multitudes, and spit. Oh, I forgot. Didn't people who chew tobacco, I know we don't know anything about chewing tobacco, right? But then people who chew tobacco, don't they have like a little cup that they spit in? Can someone give me a cup? Jason, can you give me a cup? Maybe we have a cup in the fellowship hall. You can bring me a little cup, and maybe we can see if we can work with my spit a little bit here today, this morning. If Jesus did it, come on. If Jesus did it, I think I'll be all right. So these stories here, that's what we're actually going to look at here today, is the repetition of these stories. And in fact, what we're going to realize is that these stories are all connected and they're all related to one another. So in Mark 4, you have Jesus calming the storm. In Mark 6, you have Jesus feeding the 5,000. In Mark 6, you have Jesus calming the storm again. Wait, what's going on here? And then in Mark 8, you have Jesus feeding the 4,000. Again, these stories repeat over and over again, and it's not a typo. And then in between these stories of calming the storm and feeding the 4,000 and calming the storms and being in the boat, in between these stories, you have these other stories mixed in there about Jesus spitting. And let me see here, the first one in Mark chapter 7, he spits and he puts his fingers in the individual's ears, and then he spits and he touches the individual's tongue. And then in Mark chapter 8, he will do this again. He will spit, and then he will touch. Thank you. Really good. All right. Really good. Ready to go? Ready to go. And then he spit, and then he touched the individual's eyes. What is going on here with these stories? In fact, this section here, if you notice on the slide, it says Mark chapter 4 through 8. This section is actually, these stories will bookend this section of Mark chapter 4 through Mark chapter 8. They will bookend these sections. Mark chapter 4 will begin with these stories, and Mark chapter 8 will end with these stories. I mentioned in between you have the spitting, and so what is going on here? Now, I even got a little bit, and then even in our sermon title, this will be another theme, as our sermon title suggests, is eyes and ears and mouths. This will be a theme throughout this section as well, all right? So we have these stories that bookend this section, Mark chapter 4 through 8. We also have ears, eyes, and mouths that will be a theme throughout this section as well. In fact, this section will even begin with the theme of eyes, ears, and mouth, and it will also end this section with eyes, ears, and mouth. And I got a little bit nerdy, if you'll forgive me on this one. Forgive me, I don't know, John, I think you'll be able to appreciate this here, a chiasm, right? Okay, any other theologians? Mark, you'll be able to appreciate this, a chiasm. Okay, all right. I got a little nerdy on this one here, but this is something that theologians do. They will actually chart out stories and the biblical stories, and they call it chiasm because it's kind of in the form of an X, at least half of the X, right? And so these chapters chapters, they start with Mark chapter 4, again, calming the storm. Then Mark 5 is a transition. Then Mark chapter 6, he's feeding the 5,000. And then it happens again. That's a typo there. Mark chapter 6, he calms the storm again. Mark chapter 7, there's a transition. And then Mark chapter 8, he ends with feeding the 4,000. And so this is a very, fascinating literary structure from this passage here of Mark chapter 4 through Mark chapter 8. So are you there? Mark chapter 4. So let's get right into it. Mark chapter 4 and verse 9. And let's begin by reading this section here. And then Jesus said, whoever has ears. There it is again. Oh, there it is. Just started from the very beginning. Whoever has ears to hear, let them hear. And this is in the context of Jesus telling his parables. I think we're going to get to the parables of Jesus eventually here. But so he begins this section, whoever has ears to hear, let them hear. Verse 10, when he was alone, the 12 and the others around him, they asked him about the parables, and he told them, well, the secret of the kingdom of God has been given to you, but to those on the outside, everything is said in parables. Verse 12, so that they may be ever seeing. Did you catch that there? Eyes here, there are eyes. They may be ever seeing, but never perceiving. They may be ever hearing. They're the ears again, but never understanding. Otherwise, they might turn and be forgiven. So even this section begins with ears, but we want to look at the story of Jesus calming the storm. So jump down to Mark chapter 4 and verse 35. Mark chapter 4 and verse 35. And so he's taught the people in parables. Mark chapter 4 verse 35. Now it says that when that day when evening came, he said to his disciples, let us go over to the other side. And leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. And there were also other boats with him. And a furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. And verse 38, Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion, and the disciples woke him, and they said to him, Teacher, don't you care if we drown? And he got up, he rebuked the wind and said to the waves, Quiet, be still. And then the wind died down and it was completely calm. And he said to his disciples, Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? And they were terrified, and they asked each other, Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. Now, this has also been another question that we've been asking quite a bit here in our story through the Gospel of Mark, right? Who is this? Who is this man that even nature obeys his commands? So this is actually going to be a theme as well, all right? So we have the ears, we have the eyes, we have the mouth, we have hearing, seeing, we have the 4 stories that will be repeated, but even this question becomes a theme, and what you're going to find out is that this question will pop up continually in this section, and this section in Mark 8 will actually end with this very same question as well. Who is this man? Okay, so let's keep moving on here. So this is the first story, the calming of the storm. All right, now let's move on here to Mark chapter 6, and we're going to see the story of the feeding of the 5,000 and then the calming of the storm again. So turn your Bibles to Mark chapter 6. Mark chapter 6, feeding of the 5,000. Mark chapter 6 and verse 34. Do you have it there? Let me know. Mark chapter 6, verse 34. There's some other transitional stories, but again now, Mark chapter 6, verse 34. When Jesus landed, he's in a boat. When he landed and he saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And so he began teaching them many things. And by this time it was late in the day, so that his disciples came to him. This is a remote place, they said, and it's already very late. Send the people away so that they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. But he answered, You give them something to eat. And they said to him, well, that would take more than a half a year's wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat? And I'm just going to stop there. I'm not going to comment too much on this story here, but I actually started doing the math. I'm not going to talk about this, but I started doing the math, right? Because they say there's 5,000 people there, and Jesus is like, give them to eat, which is actually a reference to a story of the prophet Elisha. in 2 Kings. You can look that up if you want to on your own time. Elisha said something very similar to what Jesus said, give them something to eat. And not only that, but this is also an allusion to a story of Moses and the manna. But I'll let you look that up here at your other time. But I was fascinated because the disciples say this takes about half a year's wages. Some translations say this would cost 200 denarii. And some other translations say this would be 8 months' wages. And so I crunched the numbers. I'm going to throw a few numbers out there for you who like numbers. Maybe you can do the math. A denarii was the wage that a working man's wage for one day. That's what a denarii is. So 200 denarii would be how many working days? 200 working days, right? And then when I started thinking about that, I was like, man, how many days do we work here in the United States of America, right? So I Googled, was it U.S. Department of Labor? I don't know. And so they gave me this figure. I don't know if we work more today or less than people in ancient times, but it said, the U.S. Department of Labor says that there are 250 working days in a year. There are 105 weekends. And then there are 10 days of vacation, right? That's about 2 weeks. You add all that up, that's 365 days out of the year. And then I started calculating. I was like, well, how much does a working man earn today? Should we do the minimum wage? Is that $7.50? But is that really a livable wage? I don't know, So I was like, what, should we do $20 an hour? Should we Anyway, so I started doing this. I started doing the math. You can do the math on your own. Or then I started thinking, well, how much would one meal cost for one person, right? I was like, $7.50 maybe? $8. All right, anyways, I think I'm losing the people, except the people who are, into numbers. All right, so I came up with an amount, approximately $40,000 to feed 5,000 people. Now, Mark just says 5,000 people, but we know from Matthew and we know from Luke that it was 5,000 people plus women and children, So now you're talking about, people say close to 10,000, people, and then I'm trying to think of some stadiums in Jacksonville, that would gather 10,000 people, and imagine feeding 10,000 people. I mean, I don't know if there's any event that feeds 10,000 people at any one time. Is there something like that? I mean, I know there's vendors, right, when you go to a stadium, a football field, but to have everybody eat a meal, 10,000 people eat a meal at the same time, anybody? Can you think of an example? I was trying to think of an example, like who does events where they feed 10,000 people, like one meal? What was that, cruise ships? All at the same time? Oh, okay, well, maybe we take, I don't know, I imagine they rotate things. Are there 10,000 people on a cruise ship? I've never been on a cruise, 6,000 people. All right, well, that's close, right? If you can imagine what that would look like and how much that would cost and all the logistics to feeding that many people. All right, but I won't comment on that anymore. That's for you guys to figure out how that would work. Okay, all right. So what's happening? Let's keep reading the story. All right. You give them something to eat, they said. Verse 38, and so Jesus asked them, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. And when they found out, they said 5 and 2 fish. And then Jesus directed them to have all the people sit down in groups on the green grass. And so they sat down in groups of hundreds and 50s, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, Jesus gave thanks, and he broke the loaves, and then he gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all, and they all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish, and the number of men who had eaten was 5,000. Okay, now I think where I'm going with this is, and this is the theme of ears, eyes, and mouth, is that what Jesus did here is impossible. What he did here is impossible. And the question for the readers, and even the question for the disciples, because the disciples are trying to figure out, how are we going to feed them? This is impossible. And then Jesus asks them, well, you give them something to eat, and they're thinking, well, no, this is impossible, and and all the questions that they were asking. And then I think what the underlying question is here is, are you seeing this? 5,000 people sitting in groups of 50, right, and 100. 5 loaves and 2 fish, and then there's 12 basketfuls. Are you seeing this? Are you hearing him? Are you hearing him bless the food and then telling him, the disciples, to pass it out to others? How about your mouth? Were you there? Did you taste that bread? And did you taste that fish? Who is this man that is doing the impossible? All right, let's keep going here, though. Verse 45. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to Bethsaida while he dismissed the crowd. And after leaving them, he went up to a mountainside to pray. Later that night, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and he was alone on land. And he saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. And I don't know if this is some type of supernatural sight or if Jesus is on the shore and he's able to see, them struggling on the lake. I'm not exactly sure what's going on here, but he says that he sees the disciples straining at the oars, and shortly before dawn, he went out to them, walking on the lake. Remember the theme: eyes, ears, mouths. He was about to pass by them. But when they saw him with their eyes, walking on the lake, they thought, their understanding, their perception of what they're seeing is that he's a ghost. I love it in the Greek. It's phantasma is what the Greek is. Phantasma. He's a ghost. Now, I don't know what kind of concept the disciples had about the state of the dead. Seventh-day Adventists, right? We don't believe in ghosts, and I don't know what the disciples believed about what happened to people when they died, but they see this, and they say it's a ghost. And their mouth. What does it say? And they cried out with their mouth, because they all saw him again with their eyes, and they were terrified. And immediately he spoke to them. What did they hear? With their ears. And he spoke to them, and he said, "Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." And then he climbed into the boat with them, and the wind died down. And they were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves, and their hearts were hardened. Okay, so now you have to stop here on verse 52, because, what in the world does the storm on the boat have to do with the loaves? Did you catch that, how Mark connects the two together? He says that they were amazed, verse 52. It said they were completely amazed, verse 52, because they had not understood about the loaves, and their hearts were hardened. What's going on here? Again, what do the loaves have to do with this storm? Again, this guy, Jesus, is doing the impossible. He just did the impossible with the loaves. You saw it, you heard it, you tasted it. Now he's walking on water. You're seeing it, you're hearing him, you're crying out in fear. Who is this person? This person here is not just any old rabbi. He's not just any old teacher. This person is doing the impossible. Again, the question begs is, who is this man? Now we're going to move here to Mark chapter 7. And this is a transitional passage, but again, this theme comes back up of seeing with your eyes and hearing with your ears and understanding with your heart. In Mark chapter 7 and verse 14, Jesus is nothing related to the fish or to the storm. But Jesus will say this here, Mark chapter 7 and verse 14. Again, Jesus called the crowd to him, and he said, "Listen to me, everyone, and," what does he say? "And understand." He'll say this again here in verse 17, because he explains what he's going to say. And then verse 17, after he had left the crowd and entered the house, verse 17, his disciples asked him about this parable, verse 18. And my translation says, "Are you so dull?" I think some other translations say, "Do you not yet understand?" is what he asked them. "Do you not yet understand? Don't you see? Or don't you understand?" Against the theme of the eyes and the ears and the heart and understanding. Don't you understand? And then he'll go on to do this explanation here. But see, the words that Jesus is using here are the two Greek words. Do you not understand? That would be asunetoi. Now that's, if you notice that A prefix, again, we've talked about that A prefix quite a bit, right? That A prefix kind of denies what comes after it, right? And so asunetoi actually comes from the Greek word sunemi, and soon, the preposition soon means with in the Greek, and noemi is a conjugated form of noeo, which is where we get the word to know. from, or knowledge from. Noeo in the Greek, to know. And so tsunami is with knowledge. Almost literally it means with or putting all the pieces together. And you're putting all the pieces together, and therefore you have understanding. But asunetoi is you are without understanding. And so Jesus is speaking to the crowds, and he's saying, I want you to understand. I want you to put all the pieces together and come with understanding. But then to his disciples in verse 17, he's telling them, are you without understanding still at this point? All right, but I digress. Let's keep going here. In other words, Jesus is asking them, do you understand? Do you perceive? Do you see? Do you hear? Do you know this man is doing the impossible? Who is this man? And so as an object lesson in Mark chapter 7 and verse 31, Mark chapter 7 and verse 31, do you not hear? Do you not listen? Do you not yet understand? In verse 31, then Jesus left the vicinity of Tyre, and he went through Sidon down to the Sea of Galilee and into the region of the Decapolis. Verse 32, and there some people brought to him a man who was, what's wrong with his ears? He can't hear. Is he the only one that has ears and can't hear? And so they brought to him a man who was deaf, and he could hardly talk. And they begged Jesus to place his hand on him. Verse 33, and so Jesus took him aside, away from the crowd, and Jesus put his fingers into the man's ears. And then, I don't know, I think that was kind of weak. You guys catch that? Maybe some spilled on my beard, I don't know. He spit, and he touched the man's tongue. And he looked up to heaven with a deep sigh. The sigh will be repeated again in a couple chapters. He looked up to heaven with a deep sigh, and he said to him, Hephatha, which means be opened. And at this, the man's ears were open, and his tongue was loosened, so that he began to speak plainly. And Jesus commanded them not to tell anyone, but the more he did so, the more they kept talking about it. Verse 37, and people were overwhelmed with amazement. He has done everything well, they said. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. But does he? But does he really make the deaf hear and the mute speak? Can he really make those with ears hear? Can he really make those with eyes to see what's happening? Can he really make those with mouths and with tongues to speak plainly and to give witness of what they're experiencing? What a contradiction. This man is doing the impossible. Who is this man? And so chapter 8, Mark chapter 8 and verse 1, during those days another large crowd gathered. And since they had nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to him, and they said, I have compassion for these people. They have already been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them home hungry, they will collapse on the way, because some of them have come a long distance. And his disciples answered, but where in this remote place can anyone get enough bread to feed them? And Jesus asked, how many loaves do you... Wait a minute here. Stop. As I'm reading this, I'm thinking, deja vu. Anybody else? Deja vu. What's going on here? Didn't we just read this a few chapters ago? And aren't we even repeating and saying the same exact words for a second time, Jesus and then the disciples? And his disciples answered, "But where in this remote place can anyone get enough bread to feed them? And how many loaves do you have?" Jesus asked. And they said, "Well, we have 7, they replied. And he told the crowd to sit down on the ground. This sounds all too familiar. And we had taken the 7 loaves, and he had given thanks, and he had broke them and gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people. And they did so, and they had a few small fish as well. And he gave thanks for them also, and he told the disciples to distribute them. And the people ate, and they were satisfied. And afterward, the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. About 4,000 were present. And after he had sent them away, he got into a boat with his disciples. Again, here you have the feeding, you got a boat. You have the same story over and over and over again. At this point, I'm asking myself, haven't I been here before? Have you ever found yourself through life wondering, haven't I been here before? Wait a minute, haven't I said this exact same thing? Hasn't someone said the same exact thing to me? I think I know how this is going to go. I think I know how this story is going to end. I think I know where this relationship is going to end up and what's going to happen. I think I've been here before. You ever found yourself in that situation? But you see, in whatever situation you find yourself in, I think what we need to highlight from these stories is that no matter what situation you find yourself in, Jesus will help you. Jesus is the answer for whatever it is that you're going through. So whether it's Mark chapter 4 and you're finding yourself in a storm crying out to Jesus, the solution for the disciples was Jesus. And the solution for you, no matter what storm you're going through, is Jesus. If you find yourself sinking like the disciples were sinking, the solution is Jesus. If you find yourself drowning the way the disciples found themselves drowning, the answer is Jesus. If you find yourself that you can't see, that you're blind, that you can't hear, that you can't speak clearly, you don't have the courage to speak or to say what needs to say, the answer is Jesus. If you've ever found yourself in a situation where you don't understand, you are without knowledge, the answer is Jesus. If you feel that you can't quite put all the pieces together with what's going on, you're sick or you're hungry, whatever it is that you're going through, the answer is Jesus. And so, again, Jesus feeds the 4,000, and he's in a boat again. There is no storm this time, verse 11, but I think it's important for us to read this here. And the Pharisees came, and they began to question Jesus and to test him, and they asked him for a sign from heaven. Wait a minute, where have you been? Where have you been for the last, I don't know how many years already Jesus has been ministering. Where have you been at least for the last 2 years? You're asking for a sign from heaven. They asked for a sign from heaven, and what did he do, verse 12? What does it say? He sighed deeply, just like he did when he was opening the ears of the man who was deaf and opening his mouth and his tongue. He sighed deeply because here are individuals that though they have eyes, they can't see. Though they have ears, they can't hear. They have a mouth, they have a heart, and they don't understand what they're seeing and what they're experiencing. He sighed deeply. Why does this generation ask for a sign? Truly, I tell you, no sign will be given to it. The truth is, already enough signs had been given to them. And it almost reminds me of a bad relationship. Have you ever been in a bad relationship? You don't have to raise your hand, and the person is asking for you more, just show me, that you really love me, or show me that I can trust you, right? And every time you show them, then they ask for something else, and then you can never fill that void of all the things that they're asking of you. You don't have to say if you've been in a relationship like that, right? But it's you don't need to show them anymore. It's enough. It's enough. It's a bad relationship. You probably need to get out of it. But anyways, but coming back to here, no sign will be given to you. There's been enough signs already. Jesus has given enough signs. Verse 13. And then he left them and got back into the boat and crossed to the other side. Verse 14. And the disciples had forgotten to bring bread. Again, bread and the boats and the storms. And they forgot to bring bread except for one loaf that they had with them in the boat. And Jesus says, be careful, Jesus warned them. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and of that of Herod. And they discussed with one another, and they said, is that because we don't have any bread? And aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, why are you talking about having no bread? Did you not? Your eyes, right? Again, the eyes. Didn't you see and didn't you hear and didn't you touch and taste? Did you not understand? Are you still without understanding? Have you still not put all the pieces together? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? Don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many basketful pieces did you pick up? 12, they replied. And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketful of pieces did you pick up? They answered 7. And he said to them, do you still not understand? And the truth is, do you still not understand who I am? I am the answer to all of your problems. So whatever situation you find yourself in, do you not understand? And so then in verse 22, we're going to wrap it up with this one here. Again, are you without understanding or with understanding? And so again, verse 22, it came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. And when he had spit on the man's eyes, and when he had put his hands on him, Jesus asked, do you see anything? And he looked up and he said, I see people, and they look like trees walking around. Is Jesus losing his touch? Jesus just doesn't have it anymore. And so what Jesus is doing as he's concluding this section, or as Mark is recording this and concluding this section, what Jesus is doing is he is taking this individual, he's taking this man, and this man now becomes an object lesson. How many times does Jesus have to touch your eyes to heal you? How many times does he have to put his fingers in your ears so that you can hear? How many times does he have to touch your mouth or your tongue or provide for you or multiply the bread and the loaves and the fishes? How many times do we have to go around in the same circles over and over and over again until we finally realize who this man is? Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And so he looked up and said, I see people, and they look like trees walking around. And so once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes a second time, and then his eyes were opened, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And so the section has wrapped up. And the section has wrapped up the same way this section began in Mark chapter 4. Whoever has ears to hear, let them hear. Whoever has eyes to see, let them see, and hearts to understand. And in fact, the section in verse 27 and verse 29, Jesus now begins to ask them the very same question that was also in Mark chapter 4, which is, who is this man that even the storms, right, and the sea and the winds, they obey them? In verse 27 and 29, now Jesus, after doing this, ending this section, now Jesus asks his disciples, and so who do the people say I am? And who do you say that I am? Newport Richie. Are your eyes open? Are your ears open? Do you perceive what God is doing in your life, in this church? Or are we, like the disciples of old, going around and around and around in circles?